Most ancient cultures celebrated the birth of a child. Not Sparta. In Sparta, a baby's first audience wasn't a lullaby, it was a jury. Imagine being born and, within days, carried before a council of elders who decide whether you're worth keeping. That's not poetic metaphor. That's literal Spartan law. And it was all perfectly legal, even encouraged. See, Sparta didn't just want warriors. It wanted perfect warriors. No crying. No weakness. No disability. No fragility. A crooked leg? A soft cry? You might be left on a hillside to die. That hill even had a name, Mount Taygetus, the so-called deposit of the unfit. If you passed the inspection, you lived. If you didn't, you were exposed to the elements. No name. No burial. Just gone. This was the beginning of a lifelong truth in Spartan society. Your value only existed in your usefulness to the state. Even as an infant, your life had to prove its worth. And here's the wild part, this wasn't seen as cruel. It was righteous. It was duty. Spartans believed that a flawed soldier could break the phalanx, could get a brother killed, could tarnish the honor of the city. Better to eliminate weakness early than suffer defeat later. So they culled the unworthy like farmers pruning a tree. To outsiders, it was monstrous. To Spartans, it was survival. From the very start, a Spartan child didn't belong to his parents. He belonged to Sparta. The state had more power over a newborn than the mother who bore him. And the system didn't stop at the birth check. Oh no. That was just the warm-up. If you made it through the first days, you were handed over to your mother, but not for doting affection. Spartan mothers were trained to raise sons for war. They didn't baby you. They taught you endurance. Pain was to be swallowed. Hunger was to be ignored. Crying was shameful. Softness was dangerous. Even lullabies carried warnings about dying with honor and never running from battle. So while other Greek children were told fairy tales about gods and monsters, Spartan boys heard stories about bravery, sacrifice, and blood. But why go to these extremes? Because Sparta had no walls. Literally. Unlike most city-states, Sparta didn't surround itself with massive stone defenses. When someone once criticized this, a Spartan reportedly pointed to his soldiers and said, "These are Sparta's walls." Their logic was terrifyingly simple. If the people were weak, walls wouldn't save them. If the people were strong, walls were unnecessary. So Sparta doubled down on building the strongest people possible, even if that meant discarding the weak at birth. It's tempting to see all this as cartoonish or brutal. But it was a deeply embedded worldview. Spartans weren't cruel for cruelty's sake. They genuinely believed that suffering purified the soul and made you fit to defend the homeland. Death wasn't tragic if it served the state. And that belief began the moment a child drew their first breath. By age 7, boys would be ripped from their mothers and thrown into the infamous Agoge, but we'll get to that. For now, it's worth pausing to absorb this. The first lesson every Spartan child received was this. You are not your own. Your body belongs to Sparta. Your purpose is to serve. And if you can't do that, you don't belong. That's how they created warriors who didn't care about dying. Because from the very beginning, living was a privilege you had to earn. If you survived the first brutal inspection, congratulations, you were now eligible for a second kind of death. A slower one. One that started at age 7. This was the Agoge, and it was less like a school and more like a government-sanctioned boot camp disguised as a coming-of-age ritual. At 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and tossed into an unforgiving brotherhood of pain, starvation, humiliation, and combat. The state became their parent. Teachers became tormentors. And friends? Friends were just fellow survivors of the same cruelty. The Agoge didn't just teach boys to fight. It taught them how to endure everything. Cold, hunger, pain, fear, boredom. There were no beds. No shoes. You were lucky if you had one cloak to wear through winter. The point wasn't to prepare boys for battle. The point was to prepare them for suffering. Because Sparta believed a man who could survive anything could kill anything. Stealing was encouraged, but only if you didn't get caught. If you were caught, you were beaten. Not because you took something, but because you were clumsy enough to get caught. The lesson? Think like a soldier. Be clever. Be silent. Be invisible. It's not about morality. It's about survival and strategy. Speaking of beatings, those were normal, too. Boys were whipped regularly for rule breaking. And sometimes, they were whipped for sport. There was even a contest where boys were lashed in public until they passed out or died, just to prove their endurance. Parents watched. Priests officiated. The crowd cheered. This was Spartan education. But don't get it twisted, this wasn't random sadism. Every part of the Agoge was calculated. The point was to break the boy without breaking the soldier. You strip away fear, comfort, and identity until all that's left is someone who fights without hesitation. That was the ideal Spartan man. Even literacy was treated as an afterthought. Sure, they taught some reading and writing, but it was minimal. Too many books, and a boy might start thinking for himself. The goal wasn't to produce philosophers. It was to produce warriors who could follow orders, take pain, and kill without flinching. And if you're wondering where the adults were, don't. Discipline came from all the boys who had already survived the worst. They became the new tormentors, passing down cruelty like a torch. Violence wasn't just normalized. It was institutionalized. Tradition said, you were broken, now it's your turn to break someone else. And remember, this wasn't just sanctioned by the state, it was celebrated. A boy who excelled in the Agoge was honored. A boy who hesitated, cried, or showed mercy, publicly shamed. Mocked. The Agoge didn't just forge fighters. It erased the concept of self. These kids weren't raised to be anything, they were raised to serve something. Loyalty to the state was absolute. Individuality was weakness. You didn't live for yourself. You lived for Sparta. You died for Sparta. That was the deal. And yes, death was always in the air. Even in childhood. Especially in childhood. Because to the Spartans, growing up soft was worse than dying young. Better to fall in training than to live in shame. This wasn't a bug in the system. This was the system. And somehow, despite, or because of, all this, the Spartan soldier became the most feared warrior in the ancient world. Not because he was the strongest. Not because he had the best weapons. But because he wasn't afraid to die. The Agoge had already killed his fear. By the time a Spartan boy graduated, he was no longer a child. He wasn't even quite a man. He was something else. A weapon. A tool. A ghost in flesh, trained to serve, bleed, and perish if necessary, all without complaint. And to think, it started with a child being told, you don't belong to you. If you asked a Spartan what mattered most, he wouldn't say glory. He wouldn't say victory. He'd say loyalty. Not to himself. Not even to his family. But to the unit. To the phalanx. To the men standing on either side of him with their shields raised and jaws clenched. That was the true soul of Sparta. Because in Sparta, survival meant nothing without unity. You didn't earn honor alone, you earned it by holding the line, never breaking formation, and never putting yourself above your brothers. Ever. This wasn't poetic philosophy. It was battlefield logic. The Spartans fought in a tight formation called a phalanx, a human wall of shields and spears. Each man's shield didn't just protect himself, it protected the man to his left. If one soldier fled, the wall collapsed. And collapse meant death. Not just for him. For everyone. So a Spartan's greatest duty wasn't to be brave. It was to never be the reason that wall failed. This is why the worst insult you could give a Spartan wasn't coward. It was individual. Someone who acted for himself. Someone who thought he was special. In Sparta, the worst kind of soldier was the one who thought his life mattered more than the lives next to him. That's why loyalty wasn't just encouraged. It was weaponized. From the first day in the Agoge, boys were grouped into small units that trained, ate, fought, and bled together. They learned to rely on each other more than they did their own families. If you got sick, it was your unit that cared for you. If you disobeyed, it was your unit that punished you. If you succeeded, it was their success too. You weren't just taught to fight. You were taught to never fight alone. Even affection was weaponized. Spartan boys were paired with older mentors, sometimes warriors, sometimes lovers, who were responsible for molding them into proper soldiers. The idea wasn't romantic. It was strategic. If you loved your mentor, you'd fight harder to impress him. If you loved your brothers, you'd die before letting them fall. Emotional bonds made better killers. The state didn't care if it was strange. The state cared that it worked. And it worked very well. A loyal Spartan wasn't one who obeyed blindly. He was one who trusted his comrades completely. Who knew, without doubt, that every man in the line would rather die than leave him behind. That kind of trust created something terrifying. Warriors who didn't flinch when ordered into hopeless battle. Because when your life is stitched to the lives around you, dying alone is shameful. But dying together? That's holy. And if someone did break that bond, if someone fled the battlefield, they weren't just seen as cowards. They were seen as traitors. Their names were smeared. their families disgraced. They'd have to live on the edge of town, wear strange clothes, and be avoided like a plague. People wouldn't talk to them. Women wouldn't marry them. Children would mock them. The state didn't need executioners. Shame did the job better. In Sparta, disloyalty didn't just ruin your reputation. It ruined your identity. Because who were you, if not one of the phalanx? What was left of you, if not your place in the line? And so the lesson drilled into every Spartan's bones was simple and final: you do not matter. We matter. It's no wonder they didn't fear death. When your death is part of a greater whole, when it proves your loyalty, it doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like fulfillment. This is why Spartans didn't brag about their kills. They bragged about holding formation. About standing firm when others might have broken. About not flinching when the order came to die. Because at the end of the day, a Spartan's worth wasn't measured in enemies slain. It was measured in how long he stayed standing beside his brothers, even when he knew he wouldn't survive. In Sparta, the most honorable death wasn't just about falling in battle. It was who you died beside. To perish alone was shame. But to die with your brothers, locked shield to shield, was transcendence. That was the ultimate achievement, not survival, not victory, synchronized sacrifice. It wasn't just military strategy. It was cultural scripture. Stories of glorious last stands weren't just passed down, they were sung. Remembered. Enshrined. A Spartan who died with his brothers wasn't mourned. He was immortalized. Take the Battle of Thermopylae. Everyone knows the basics: 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, holding off an overwhelming Persian force. But what people often miss is what mattered most to the Spartans: that they died together. It wasn't a suicide mission. It was the purest expression of Spartan loyalty. They didn't flinch. They didn't retreat. And most importantly, they didn't abandon one another. That battle became a symbol not because they fought well, but because they died as one. See, Spartan ideology taught that the moment of death reveals a man's truth. Does he run? Does he beg? Or does he hold the line, even when the world is falling apart? If your final breath is spent beside your brothers, facing the enemy as one, you have nothing to fear, not even death itself. Because the legacy of that unity is what lives on. And Spartans were obsessed with legacy. They believed in two kinds of immortality, one through children, and one through honor. Since most Spartan men didn't raise families until after age 30, battlefield glory became the first path to eternal remembrance. But the catch? That glory had to be shared. No lone heroes. No flashy solo kills. That was for other Greeks, Athenians, maybe. Spartans didn't celebrate outliers. They celebrated cohesion. A perfect death was one where no one broke rank. Where every soldier held the line until the last man fell. That's how you proved that your training, your loyalty, your life had meant something. And that idea was reinforced everywhere. The shields Spartans carried weren't just for defense. They were sacred. Losing your shield was one of the worst dishonours, not because it meant you ran, but because it meant you failed your brothers. A shield protected the man next to you. If you lost it, you put him at risk. Mothers didn't tell their sons to come back victorious. They told them to come back with their shield, or on it. Alive with honor, or dead with dignity. There was no third option. Even in Spartan tombstones, the wording mattered. Only two kinds of people received marked graves: women who died in childbirth and men who died in battle. Because both were seen as giving everything for Sparta. And again, never alone. Always as part of something larger. That's what made dying with your brothers sacred. It wasn't just death. It was a final act of unity. It said, I never faltered. I never broke. I stood where I was needed. And I stood with them. Compare that to surviving a lost battle. Spartans who lived while their comrades died weren't seen as lucky. They were seen as cursed. Survivors often lived in silence, guilt heavy in their bones. Not because they'd failed to fight, but because they'd failed to die with their brothers. In Sparta, you weren't expected to return. You were expected to fulfill your role, no matter the cost. The true shame wasn't death. The true shame was being the last one standing. Because in a culture where loyalty defined your identity, living without your brothers meant living without yourself. That's why Spartan warriors marched into battle calm, even cheerful. They weren't resigned to die, but if death came, they hoped it came together. Because what greater honor could there be than to stand in the line, shoulder to shoulder, knowing that even your death would be shared? And to the Spartans, that shared death wasn't the end. It was the pinnacle. A seal. A proof that you had been forged in the fire of the Agoge, tempered in loyalty, and unleashed as part of something far greater than yourself. To die with your brothers was to die correctly. In most cultures, returning from war is the goal. Survival is seen as triumph. In Sparta, it was more complicated. Because if you came home alive, the question was why. Did you survive because the battle was won? Or because you ran while others died? Coming home alive wasn't always a celebration. Sometimes, it was a source of shame. And that's a twist that modern minds struggle to grasp. How could surviving make you suspect? But in Sparta, death in battle was proof. Proof you fought to the bitter end. Proof you didn't flinch. Proof you were loyal. Coming home meant the state had to wonder, did you do your duty? Or did you prioritize yourself? And no one was safe from that judgment. The most infamous example? Aristodemus. He fought at Thermopylae, yes, that battle, and he was one of the few Spartans who survived. Not because he ran. Not because he surrendered. But because he had a legitimate illness and was ordered by Leonidas to return home. Even with permission, even with a medical excuse, Aristodemus came back alone. And that was enough. When he returned to Sparta, he was not welcomed. He was ignored. Mocked. Publicly humiliated. People refused to speak to him. Children called him a coward in the streets. His name became a cautionary tale. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he had survived, and that alone cast doubt on his honor. This is how deeply embedded the shame of survival was. The next year, Aristodemus went into battle again. This time, he fought with a fury that terrified even his comrades. He charged recklessly, seeking death. And when it finally came, it was said that he died with honor. But still, some Spartans muttered that he had been too desperate for redemption. Too eager. Even his final act wasn't free from scrutiny. Because in Sparta, intention mattered. Surviving wasn't the problem. Surviving without glory was. And Spartans didn't define glory the way most people do. It wasn't about victory. It wasn't even about killing enemies. It was about enduring, standing your ground when it was easier to flee, holding your shield up when your arm wanted to drop, dying when others would beg to live. That's why Spartan shields were more than gear. They were symbols. Losing a helmet or breastplate? Understandable. But losing a shield? That meant you had to drop it, maybe to run. Maybe to save yourself. And that wasn't just bad, it was unforgivable. Which is why mothers didn't greet their returning sons with hugs and tears. They met them with a glance at the shield. With it or on it. That wasn't a metaphor. It was a test. A soldier who returned without his shield had to answer for it. And often, the answer was not enough. This shame-based culture wasn't a flaw. It was the system working as intended. Spartans believed that fear of shame was stronger than fear of pain. And fear of dishonor was stronger than fear of death. So they made survival suspicious. They made glory conditional. And they made the price of cowardice social exile. Spartan survivors of lost battles weren't reintegrated. They were marked. They had to wear special clothing. Shave half their beard. Sit away from others at meals. This wasn't just punishment, it was permanent humiliation. A reminder, to everyone and to themselves, that they hadn't measured up. Even Spartan kings weren't exempt. If a king survived a disastrous campaign, he could be tried, fined, even exiled. Because leadership wasn't about strategy. It was about dying when your men died. Anything less was betrayal. And betrayal didn't need to be proven in court. It was proven in whispers. In how people looked at you. In how they didn't look at you. This is what made the Spartan war machine so terrifying. It wasn't just training or tactics. It was the psychological conditioning that survival without glory was worse than death. So when Spartan warriors marched to battle, they weren't just prepared to die. They were prepared to die properly. And if they didn't? They were prepared to suffer for it. Because in Sparta, coming home alive wasn't always a victory. Sometimes, it was a sentence. For most cultures, funerals are quiet things. Gentle. Grieving. But in Sparta, funerals for fallen warriors were not hushed. They were loud. Defiant. And in their own way, joyful. Because dying in battle wasn't a tragedy. It was an achievement. Only two types of Spartans received marked tombstones. Women who died in childbirth and men who died in war. That's it. Everyone else was buried quietly, without fanfare. But a warrior who died on the battlefield? He earned a grave with his name, his family, and his sacrifice carved in stone. Not for remembrance. For inspiration. The Spartans didn't mourn like other Greeks. They didn't wail or tear their clothes. Instead, they sang. War songs, battle chants, poems written to honor the dead not as victims, but as heroes. It was less a farewell and more a victory lap. A Spartan funeral wasn't about comfort. It was about legacy. Imagine standing at the funeral of a fallen soldier. The family stands tall. There are no tears. The elders recite his deeds. The young boys listen, wide-eyed. The women nod in approval. And in the background, the warriors sing of courage, fire, and blood. It was all designed to do one thing: glorify death in service of Sparta. Because a glorious death made the unbearable bearable. It turned pain into pride. And it set the standard for every boy still alive. This is what you aim for. This is what you become. Even the music of Sparta reflected this obsession. The most famous Spartan war poet, Tertius, composed verses that were equal parts funeral elegy and battle anthem. He didn't write about falling in love or the beauty of nature. He wrote about dying well. One of his most quoted lines goes something like this: "It is a fine thing for a brave man to die in the front line. Not live. Die." That was the core message drilled into Spartan hearts from the beginning. And these songs weren't just performed at funerals. They were rehearsed during training. Sung before battles. Whispered during long marches. Every note, every lyric, every beat reminded the Spartan soldier, death is not the end. It is the test. And if you pass it, you are remembered forever. Even their battle rhythms were precise. Spartans marched to the sound of flutes in combat, not because it was charming, but because it kept the phalanx in perfect formation. Music kept fear in check. It synchronized breathing. And it turned a group of men into one terrifying, moving wall. But the funeral songs, that was where Sparta showed its soul. These weren't sad ballads. They were declarations. They praised discipline. They condemned hesitation. They spoke of brothers who stood firm, and enemies who faltered. Every verse served as a warning: do not be the one who runs. And while the dead lay silent, the song spoke for them. Even in death, a Spartan had a role to play. He was proof that the system worked. That the Agoge forged something eternal. That the line held. And that Sparta, cold, brutal, ruthless Sparta, was still standing. It wasn't just a body being buried. It was a message being sent. And the community listened. Children memorized these funeral chants. Mothers taught them alongside lullabies. The songs reminded the young what was expected. Reminded the old what had been given. And reminded the living that their time would come too. There's something both chilling and strangely poetic about it. While other cities built statues of philosophers, Sparta built its heroes in blood and music. Their greatest works of art weren't paintings or plays. They were men who stood to the last, and the songs that told of their final breath. And those songs lasted. Even centuries later, other Greeks quoted Tertius. They told stories of Spartan funerals with a mix of awe and horror. How could a people celebrate death so openly? So proudly? But that was the whole point. Spartans weren't trying to grieve. They were trying to inspire. To make sure that when the next battle came, no man would hesitate. Because when you know your death will be sung, how could you run? In most cultures, a mother's love is synonymous with protection. With softness. With the desperate hope that her child returns home safely. But not in Sparta. In Sparta, the most famous words a mother said to her son before battle weren't "be careful" or "come home." They were, "return with your shield, or on it." Translation? Win with honor, or die trying. That wasn't a metaphor. It was a command. And it came from the very people you might expect to be the most afraid of losing you. Spartan mothers weren't nurturing in the conventional sense. They weren't supposed to be. Their role wasn't to coddle or protect. It was to raise warriors, and expect them to die like one if needed. Because just like the men, Spartan women were trained by the state. They were educated. Taught to run, wrestle, fight. They exercised alongside the boys, not as soldiers but as mothers of soldiers. Their strength wasn't measured by battle scars but by how well they passed down courage. How well they buried their sons without shedding a tear. You see, Spartan women had one sacred job: produce warriors. Raise them without weakness. And then let them go, to war, to glory, to death, without interfering. If a mother showed grief after her son died in battle, it was seen as selfish. Her sorrow meant she valued him more than Sparta. And that was not acceptable. So instead of weeping, they praised. A son who died in battle was proof that she had done her duty. Her honor increased with his death. In fact, women who lost sons on the battlefield sometimes walked through town with their heads held higher, proud that their child had been worthy of death. Not survival, death. But why? Because Spartan ideology didn't stop at the edge of the battlefield. It lived in the home. The state didn't just need warriors, it needed mothers who created warriors and didn't flinch when the price came due. This wasn't a side note. It was central. From the cradle, boys were taught to fight. But from the womb, mothers were taught to let them go. And it wasn't just talk. History is filled with records of Spartan women displaying terrifying composure. One story tells of a mother who heard her 5 sons had died in war. Her only question, did we win? When she learned Sparta was victorious, she reportedly said, then I am satisfied. Another tale tells of a mother killing her own son after he fled from battle. She was so ashamed that he had survived Dishna, she ended his life herself. Was that myth? Maybe. But the fact that it was told in Sparta, celebrated, shows what the culture valued. Loyalty. Honor. Death. Not comfort. And that phrase, come back with your shield or on it, it wasn't symbolic poetry. It was practical. Spartan warriors carried heavy round shields called aspis. If you dropped it, it meant you ran. But if you died standing your ground, your body was brought back on the shield, like a stretcher. So the phrase literally meant, don't you dare return unless you've either won or died trying. Anything else brought shame. And shame was contagious. If a Spartan warrior fled battle and returned home, he didn't just stain his name. He stained his family, his mother, his siblings, his children. Everyone paid the price. So you can understand why mothers weren't encouraging their sons to survive at any cost. They were encouraging them to be worthy, even if it killed them. Especially if it killed them. This is how Sparta maintained its war machine. Not just through weapons and drills, but through mothers who turned grief into pride. Who turned loss into fuel. Who measured love not by safety, but by sacrifice. It's a worldview that feels alien to us now, maybe even horrific. But in ancient Sparta, it made perfect sense. Everyone had a role. The warrior fought. The mother sent him off without blinking. The state watched. And history remembered. Because in the end, if you were a Spartan mother, your highest honor was not keeping your son alive. It was raising a son brave enough to die the right way. To outsiders, Spartan women might have seemed heartless. Cold. Almost inhuman. But to Spartans, their pride in warrior deaths wasn't cruelty, it was virtue. The harder the loss, the higher the honor. And no one wore that pride more fiercely than a mother whose son had died for Sparta. This wasn't a rare attitude. It was expected. Even required. Because Spartan women weren't background characters. They were active enforcers of the warrior code. If a man hesitated in battle, his wife or mother might shame him publicly. Not privately, publicly. Imagine returning from war, head down, and your mother meets you with a slap, not out of rage, but humiliation. There are stories, passed down with approval, of mothers telling their sons, either come back with your shield, or don't come back at all. Others tell of women whose sons died in combat, who then walked through the city with smiles, not out of denial, but satisfaction. One quote often attributed to a Spartan woman says it all, I bore him so that he might die for Sparta. Not live a long life. Not raise a family. Die for Sparta. It sounds horrifying. But that was the culture's design. In Sparta, the state depended on this brutal maternal pride. Because without it, the system would collapse. If mothers begged their sons to stay safe, the warriors might hesitate. If women wept in the streets, others might question the price of war. But Spartan women didn't weep, they boasted. There was status in loss. To be the mother of a dead warrior meant you had succeeded in your most sacred duty. You hadn't just raised a fighter. You'd raised someone who followed through. Someone who did not run. Who stood in the line and fell in it. This social reinforcement was powerful. Shame was communal. So was pride. A Spartan woman who had lost a son might be given more respect than one whose children were still alive. Why? Because her son had already proven his worth. The other still had to earn it. Even marriage was shaped by this thinking. Women wanted to marry brave men. Not just for status, but for offspring. A Spartan woman wasn't expected to marry for love. She was expected to marry for breeding. To produce the next generation of soldiers who would carry the shield, hold the line, and, when necessary, die without fear. The state rewarded women who gave birth to many sons. Especially sons who died in war. And older women would instruct younger ones on how to raise them with the right blend of toughness, distance, and discipline. This wasn't motherly neglect. It was strategic love. Spartan women didn't ignore their children, they hardened them. Praised toughness. Punished fear. They weren't trying to create happy boys. They were trying to create survivable ones, and then teach them that survival wasn't even the goal. Even in death, the mothers were involved. When the bodies came home, Spartan women didn't wail or tear their robes like Athenian women did. They didn't hire mourners. They sang songs. They told stories of their sons' bravery. They stood tall. Because to collapse in grief would be seen as weakness, and an insult to the warrior's sacrifice. There's one chilling story of a mother who received word that all 5 of her sons had died in a single battle. Her only question was, did we win? When she heard that Sparta had been victorious, she smiled and said, then I have 5 sons still living, in glory. It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't bitterness. It was real. This brutal pride kept the Spartan war machine running. It created a society where even mourning became an act of discipline. Where even love was shaped by the needs of the state. To modern eyes, it looks merciless. But to the Spartans, it was sacred. And it worked. Their enemies feared them not just for their training, but for their mindset. They knew Spartans would never surrender. Because back home, there were mothers who would rather bury a son than welcome a coward. So when you picture a Spartan warrior standing firm on the battlefield, outnumbered, wounded, and unafraid, remember who raised him. It wasn't just the Agoge. It was a mother with a spine of iron and a voice like steel, who whispered from childhood, die well, my son, and make me proud. In most armies, retreat is a tactical option. A way to fight another day. But in Sparta, retreat was a stain. It didn't matter if the odds were hopeless or if survival was the only chance. If you turned your back on the fight, on your brothers, you turned your back on Sparta itself. And Sparta never forgot. Returning home after a retreat was like walking into your own funeral, except no one cried. No one hugged you. No one looked you in the eye. They looked through you. That's because a Spartan who survived a lost battle was never treated the same again. He became what they called a trembler, someone who had shown fear in the face of death. And fear, in Sparta, was the worst contagion of all. It wasn't just personal shame. It was civic disgrace. You were marked, literally and socially. Sometimes with a different haircut, sometimes with altered clothing. People in the street stepped aside. Children were taught not to speak with you. No one would sit beside you at meals. No one would invite you to festivals or weddings. If you tried to marry, good luck, no respectable family would let their daughter near you. You were alive, yes, but in Sparta, you were already dead. And this wasn't just about punishing weakness. It was about preserving the myth. The myth that every Spartan stood his ground. That no Spartan ever broke. The few who survived against that myth became living contradictions, and the city made them pay for it. Even if you had a reason, even if your retreat saved lives or followed orders, it didn't matter. The appearance of cowardice was enough to ruin you. Spartan society operated on extremes, complete glory or total dishonor. There was no middle ground. No, you did your best. Just did you die well, or did you run? And if you ran, they didn't care why. There's a bitter irony in how tightly Sparta clung to this shame. Because while other city-states welcomed survivors as veterans, Sparta treated them as walking failures. Survivors became warnings, examples for the next generation of boys, so they'd know what not to become. One of the most telling cases was that of Aristodemus, whom we mentioned earlier. He survived Thermopylae because of illness and returned home humiliated. He wasn't even allowed to speak in public forums. He was treated like a ghost. A man without a place. The only way to regain honor? Die in your next battle. Publicly. And even then, it might not be enough. This strictness created warriors who would rather throw themselves into a hopeless charge than come back alone. Because they knew, death on the battlefield was freedom. Survival without honor was a cage. Even within the Spartan ranks, your fellow soldiers might turn on you. Veterans who returned from other campaigns refused to speak to anyone who had ever fled. They treated retreat like betrayal, not just of Sparta, but of them. Because in a phalanx, your survival depends on the shield next to you. And if that shield is missing, it could mean your death. So a retreating soldier wasn't just seen as a coward. He was seen as a murderer by omission. This mentality created an army unlike any other. Because fear of shame became stronger than fear of pain. Stronger than fear of death. Spartans were raised to believe that honor was eternal, but dishonor lasted longer. Even in death, shame followed you. A man who had once fled might not receive the same funeral rites. His story might not be told. His name might not be carved into stone. He might be forgotten, intentionally. And that's the worst punishment of all in a culture obsessed with legacy, to be erased. Not because you didn't fight, but because you came back. It's a horrifying system, and yet, it worked. It created warriors who didn't just fight bravely, they fought desperately. Because to live dishonored was more terrifying than death. So when a Spartan stood his ground against an impossible enemy, it wasn't just about courage. It was about fear, too. The fear of what waited back home if you didn't die right. No story captures the Spartan fear of survival quite like the tragedy of Aristodemus, the warrior who lived when he wasn't supposed to. Not because he ran. Not because he surrendered. But because fate, illness, and orders told him to go home. And Sparta never forgave him for it. Let's rewind. It's the year 480 BC. The Battle of Thermopylae. King Leonidas and his famous 300 are holding off a Persian army so large it supposedly blotted out the sun. Alongside Leonidas are two Spartans, Eurytus and Aristodemus, both afflicted with a severe eye infection. Blind, in agony, and unfit to fight, they are ordered to leave the battlefield and return to Sparta. Eurytus refuses. He demands his helot servant lead him back into the fight. Blind and staggering, he dies swinging wildly in the final stand. Aristodemus follows the order. He returns home. That choice, obedient, rational, even merciful by most standards, becomes his curse. When he arrives in Sparta, he's not treated as a man who followed orders. He's treated as a traitor. No celebrations. No sympathy. Just silence. People cross the street to avoid him. Soldiers won't look him in the eye. Children whisper when he walks by. Women spit at the ground he walks on. He becomes what Spartans called a trembler, not because he showed fear, but because he was alive. The shame eats away at him. Aristodemus tries to speak in public but is shunned. He offers to fight in skirmishes but is ignored. His name isn't whispered with respect, it's hissed like a warning. The only way out? Die. Spectacularly. So the very next year, Aristodemus joins the Spartan ranks at the Battle of Plataea. And when the enemy charges, he doesn't just stand his ground, he launches forward. He fights with such reckless fury that other Spartans become concerned. He refuses to retreat, refuses to fall back, drives into enemy lines like a man possessed. And when he dies, blooded, broken, but defiantly upright, it should have been redemptive. But it wasn't. Because Sparta didn't celebrate desperation. And they didn't celebrate overcompensation. Other soldiers said Aristodemus had fought with the frenzy of a man trying to erase something. And in Sparta, the attempt to erase shame was itself dishonorable. You weren't supposed to fight for redemption. You were supposed to fight for duty. So even his glorious death was treated as suspect. He died too hard. He tried too much. Even in death, the curse followed him. And that's the cruelty of the Spartan code, it left no room for nuance. You either died perfectly the first time, or you were never quite right again. Aristodemus became a ghost in his own city. Not just after his return, but even after his death. Other Spartans were remembered. Sung about. Buried with honor. Aristodemus was a cautionary tale. He stood for everything Sparta feared: hesitation, survival, the complication of moral ambiguity. But was he really a coward? Historians have argued for centuries that he wasn't. That he did what he was told. That his later death at Plataea was every bit as brave as his comrades at Thermopylae. But Sparta didn't care about the why. It only cared about the when and the how. And if you didn't die right the first time, you were marked. Forever. That's what makes Aristodemus' story so haunting. Because it proves that in Sparta, even obedience could lead to disgrace. Even valor could be too little, too late. And even the dead could be whispered about with suspicion. It wasn't enough to fight. You had to fight the right way. At the right time. In front of the right witnesses. With the right level of calm, loyalty, and detachment. Anything less, and you weren't just judged. You were erased. The silent curse of Aristodemus wasn't that he lived. It was that he lived in a culture that only made room for perfect deaths. If you really want to understand why Spartan warriors didn't care about surviving, you can't just look at their training or their culture. You have to look at their gods. Because in Sparta, religion didn't comfort the soul, it sharpened the blade. Their beliefs weren't gentle. Their gods weren't soft. The divine wasn't a shield. It was a sword. And every Spartan grew up learning that the gods expected sacrifice, not just of sheep or grain, but of blood. At the heart of Spartan religion was a deep reverence for Ars, the god of war. While other Greek city-states built temples to Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, Sparta leaned into the chaos. They didn't worship the tactics of war. They worshipped its violence. Mars wasn't just a deity, he was an ideal. But it didn't stop with Mars. Artemis Orthea was another central figure in Spartan worship. She wasn't the kind of Artemis you read about in pretty poems. In Sparta, she was honored with a brutal festival where boys were whipped, sometimes to death, at her altar. The goal? Endure pain. Bleed for the goddess. Prove your worth through suffering. It was a religious ceremony and a public test of toughness all in one. Parents watched. Priests officiated. The gods, they believed, demanded it. That ceremony, known as the Diamastigosis, wasn't about punishment. It was about devotion. Survive the lashes, and you didn't just gain status, you gained spiritual proof that you were favored. Fail, and your shame wasn't just social. It was sacred. So from a young age, Spartans were taught this one overwhelming lesson. Pain was holy. And death? Death in battle? That was the holiest act of all. When a Spartan died fighting for the state, it wasn't just bravery, it was worship. It meant you had fulfilled your divine purpose. You had been forged in the pain of Artemis, delivered in the chaos of Mars, and laid to rest in the arms of the gods. Even the burial rituals reflected this. Only warriors who died in battle received full rites. They were buried with honors, given songs, and remembered in stone. But die from illness? An accident? Old age? No ceremony. No marker. No legacy. Because in the eyes of Spartan religion, not all deaths were equal. This belief system made fear of death irrelevant. Why fear something that made you sacred? Why dread the end when it was the beginning of your eternal reputation? And this wasn't just warrior brainwashing. The entire community believed it. Mothers believed it. Priests reinforced it. The state structured its laws and festivals to reflect it. War was divine. Death was a right. And hesitation? That was blasphemy. Even the Spartan calendar prioritized war. Religious festivals often aligned with military drills. Training exercises were held in honor of gods. And before every battle, sacrifices were made to ensure the favor of the divine. But here's the twist, sometimes, those sacrifices weren't symbolic. There are stories, some whispered, some recorded, of real blood offerings. Of captured enemies being sacrificed. Of rituals meant to honor the gods by mirroring war itself. Because for Spartans, the line between religion and combat didn't just blur, it disappeared entirely. To them, a battlefield was a temple. And falling in combat wasn't failure. It was fulfillment. This spiritual framework explains why Spartan warriors weren't just trained to die. They were blessed to. They didn't see themselves as men walking into danger. They saw themselves as vessels of divine justice. Tools of the gods. Instruments of sacred violence. When they raised their shields and charged into battle, it wasn't just duty. It was liturgy. And that changes everything. Because if death is worship, and pain is a prayer, then survival becomes secondary. Maybe even selfish. Spartans didn't fear death because they believed death in war was the only way to become truly holy. So when you picture them marching off with steady feet and blank expressions, understand this. They weren't numb. They weren't brainwashed. They believed. And that belief was stronger than fear. To truly grasp how Spartans viewed death, you have to understand this. Dying in battle wasn't just brave. It was blessed. It wasn't a loss. It was a trade, your life for divine favor. In the eyes of Spartan religion, the battlefield was the altar, and the warrior was the offering. And yes, they meant that literally. In the broader Greek world, sacrifices were common. Burnt offerings. Blood spilled. The gods were seen as powerful, temperamental beings who needed constant appeasement. But in Sparta, the intensity was cranked to 11. Their gods weren't just worshipped, they were fed. And the favorite food of the gods? Glory, pain, and blood. Before battles, Spartans made ritual sacrifices to ensure divine approval. Animals were slaughtered, their entrails examined by priests for omens. If the signs weren't favorable, the army might delay, because marching into battle without the god's blessing was worse than death. It was dishonor. But these sacrifices weren't just superstition. They were part of a greater logic. The gods demanded a price. So give them a goat now, or give them your soul later. And Spartans were fine with that. Because to them, death in war was the ultimate offering, a clean, noble transaction. Your life, in exchange for your city's safety. Your blood, for the god's favor. You died, and the divine owed you. That belief ran deep. There were even stories, half myth, half memory, of Spartans sacrificing themselves voluntarily. Of men volunteering for doomed missions not just out of duty, but because it would guarantee divine reward. To be remembered forever. To be sung about. To have your name lifted up in war songs, that was eternal life. And here's where things get even more twisted, in a way that only makes sense within Spartan logic. The Spartans believed that if you survived when you shouldn't have, if you didn't die when death was expected, you hadn't just failed your comrades. You'd cheated the gods. Survival without sacrifice was seen as stealing what belonged to them. So the shame wasn't just social, it was cosmic. You had upset the balance. You had avoided the altar. And in a world where honor and worship were fused, that was the ultimate betrayal. That's why Spartan warriors walked into battle with calm on their faces. Not because they didn't care, but because they knew what was at stake. Not just glory. Not just legacy. But divine legitimacy. Die well, and you became a sacred name. Die poorly, or worse, live without cause, and you became an echo. A disappointment. A man who stood at the altar and refused to kneel. This belief shaped how Spartans treated fallen enemies, too. Captured foes weren't always just prisoners. Sometimes, they were offerings. There are reports, fragmented, whispered, of ritual executions, performed not as cruelty, but as homage. Killing wasn't just strategy. It was devotion. Even the way Spartans buried their dead reflected this sacred mindset. Fallen warriors were sometimes buried with olive wreaths, a symbol not of peace, but of divine reward. Their graves weren't hidden in shame. They were marked with inscriptions praising their sacrifice. These weren't funerals. They were promotions, into legend. And that belief infected every corner of Spartan life. Boys in the Agoge were told stories not just of heroes, but of holy deaths. They were taught that a short life filled with pain and service was more blessed than a long one filled with comfort and obscurity. To die at 20, in the line, covered in wounds and surrounded by brothers? That was winning. Because Spartans didn't believe in heaven the way we might imagine it. They believed in remembrance. In having your name passed down. In becoming a sacred symbol. That was their paradise. Not clouds and harps, but song and story. And the path to that paradise? Ritual. Combat. Sacrifice. So the next time you picture a Spartan warrior walking calmly toward a battle he knows he won't survive, understand he wasn't resigned. He was offering himself. And he believed, truly, that the gods were watching, and smiling. The story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae is iconic, etched into stone, legend, and Hollywood. It's become shorthand for courage, sacrifice, and standing against impossible odds. But here's what most people don't realize. The 300 were not an exception. They were typical. That wasn't Sparta's one great moment, it was Sparta being Sparta. Because the truth is, there were dozens of moments like Thermopylae. We just don't talk about them. Why? Because they weren't as cinematic. No cliffs. No arrows blocking out the sun. Just men holding the line, dying without hesitation, and being quickly replaced by others trained to do the exact same thing. That's what made Sparta so terrifying. They didn't rely on heroes. They manufactured them. Thermopylae became famous because it involved a king, a narrow mountain pass, and a Persian army the size of a small continent. But Sparta's history is filled with similar acts, soldiers who marched into battles they couldn't win, who fought anyway, and who expected to die without complaint. It wasn't drama. It was policy. Let's take a closer look. Long before Thermopylae, during the First Messenian War, Spartans faced revolts and uprisings from the Helots, people they had enslaved and oppressed. These weren't just domestic skirmishes. They were brutal, drawn-out conflicts. And Spartan warriors fought them with the same suicidal commitment they'd later show at Thermopylae. They didn't expect to come back. They didn't plan to retreat. Because that wasn't the point. The point was to not break the line. Even centuries later, Spartan units fought in foreign campaigns and maintained the same standard. Whether against fellow Greeks, Persians, or internal rebels, the Spartan way was always the same. Form the phalanx, hold your ground, and never run. Thermopylae just happened to be the moment the rest of the world noticed. But to a Spartan? It was Tuesday. That's why the 300 didn't beg for recognition. They didn't deliver speeches about glory. They stood there, silent, and died because that was the assignment. Not a heroic exception, but a cultural norm. And they weren't alone. Thermopylae also featured hundreds of other Greek allies, Thespians, Thebans, Helots. But the Spartans got all the credit. Why? Because they were expected to die like that. That was the reputation they earned, not by one stand, but by generations of them. It wasn't about a single king making a brave decision. It was about a society that trained every citizen to embrace that decision without blinking. And the 300 were selected, by the way. Handpicked not because they were the best fighters, but because they were fathers of living sons. That's right, Sparta chose men who had already reproduced, so their death wouldn't reduce the citizen population. Even in sacrifice, Sparta was thinking practically. No legends. Just logistics. This attitude wasn't limited to battlefields, either. Spartan boys in the Agoge reenacted Thermopylae every day, not with Persians, but with pain, hunger, and hardship. Every whipping, every punishment, every stolen meal was a rehearsal for the real moment, standing in the line, knowing it might be your last. So when the Persians came and the king said, "We'll make our stand here," the 300 didn't flinch. They didn't need to be inspired. They'd been waiting. And afterward? Sparta didn't build a giant statue or create a national holiday. Their attitude was almost blasé. Of course they died. They were supposed to. The rest of Greece was in awe. Sparta simply moved on. That's the part we forget. The 300 were not martyrs. They were products. Built by a system that didn't train men to live, it trained them to die correctly. The only reason we remember them is because a poet picked up the pen. A historian told the story. A filmmaker added slow motion and abs. But to Sparta? It was just another Tuesday. King Leonidas. The name rings with drama. Painted across movie posters. Shouted in gym locker rooms. Reduced to one iconic line, "This is Sparta." But behind the yelling and the stylized violence was something deeper, something quieter, actually. Leonidas didn't scream about glory. He embodied it. Because in Sparta, the best way to lead wasn't to live the longest, it was to die well. And Leonidas knew that. He didn't just accept his fate at Thermopylae. He chose it. Let's start with the basics. Leonidas wasn't supposed to be king. He wasn't the oldest son. He wasn't groomed for leadership. But fate, or maybe Spartan practicality, put him on the throne when his older half-brothers died or were deemed unfit. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't even particularly politically ambitious. What he was Spartan to the core. And when Persia came knocking with demands for submission, Leonidas didn't write a rousing speech. He sent the messengers packing. Sparta would not bow. Sparta would fight. Now, here's where things get interesting. When the Persians invaded, the rest of Greece panicked. But Sparta, predictably, moved with caution. They were in the middle of a religious festival and didn't want to commit their full army. So what did Leonidas do? He gathered 300 of his best warriors and marched out, not to win, but to delay. He knew the battle was hopeless. He said so. According to sources, he consulted the oracle at Delphi and was told that either Sparta would fall, or a Spartan king must die. Leonidas chose the second option. Willingly. Calmly. Because that was the job. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to show how to lose properly. The stand at Thermopylae wasn't about tactics, it was about theater. A display of courage, unity, and sacrifice so overwhelming that it would inspire all of Greece to resist. And it worked. The delay bought the rest of the Greek city-states precious time. And the legend of the Spartans, unmoving, unyielding, unafraid, spread like wildfire. Leonidas became a martyr. But in Sparta? He became a standard. Because Spartans didn't just admire his death, they expected it. A king who died with his men was doing his duty. A king who came back without them? That would have been a disgrace. And this is where Leonidas truly shines, not in his last stand, but in his consistency. He didn't invent the Spartan ideal. He followed it. Down to the letter. Down to his last breath. There's something almost chilling in how calmly he accepted his role. No panic. No regret. Just a shield raised, a spear clenched, and a line that would not break. That calm became myth. Over time, Leonidas was remembered not just as a brave king, but as the perfect Spartan. The one who lived exactly as he was taught, and died exactly as he should. His story became scripture. A lesson for every boy in the Agoge. A warning for every general. A legend that whispered, there is only one way to die correctly. And that's what Spartans really believed. That there was a correct way to die. Not screaming. Not running. Not hiding behind politics or excuses. But standing firm. Eyes open. Feet planted. Shoulders pressed into the line, until the very end. Leonidas didn't make that myth. He didn't exaggerate it. He fulfilled it. And that's why the world remembers him, not just as a king, but as a symbol. Because even in a society obsessed with sacrifice, Even among warriors trained from childhood to die well, he still stood out. Not for being better, but for being the same. Perfectly, terrifyingly, Spartan. In most ancient cities, men wore many hats: farmer, merchant, craftsman, soldier when needed. Not in Sparta. If you were a full Spartan citizen, a Spartiates, you were legally forbidden to work a regular job. You didn't farm. You didn't trade. You didn't build anything with your hands. Your only career? Warfare. The Spartan state engineered a system where its elite class of male citizens were full-time, government-sponsored warriors. From age 7 until death or disability, your one role in society was to prepare for, train for, and die in combat. That wasn't optional. It was the entire point. The logic behind this was simple: if you want the best soldiers, don't make them juggle side hustles. Don't distract them with mundane survival. Just hand them a shield, feed them from state rations, and tell them to become the deadliest force on earth. And that's what Sparta did. But how did they afford it? Easy. They built their entire economy on the backs of the Helots, an enslaved class made up mostly of conquered peoples, especially the Messenians. These weren't a handful of servants. They were the majority of the population. And their labor propped up everything else. Helots worked the land. They grew crops. They cooked meals. They managed households. They gave the Spartiate warrior class the freedom to focus on training and warfare full-time. It was exploitation, systematic and brutal, and it allowed Spartan citizens to opt out of everyday survival. The result? A society where the only thing a Spartan male was trained to do was kill. Think about that. No trade skills. No economic independence. No legal way to be a potter, shepherd, or merchant. You existed to fight. And if you weren't fighting, you were preparing for the next battle. Even their education system reflected this. As we've seen, the Agoge didn't teach math or philosophy. It taught pain, silence, obedience, and warfare. If you wanted to become a thinker, go to Athens. If you wanted to become a hammer, go to Sparta. This setup created an elite ruling class who were terrifyingly focused. While other Greek cities debated politics in open forums, Spartans drilled. While others sailed across the seas to trade silver and spices, Spartans lifted stones, threw spears, and practiced bleeding without screaming. But there was a cost. Because when you build a society where your entire identity is based on war, peace becomes a threat. What happens when there's no war? What happens when the Helots grow restless? What happens when a warrior has nothing left to conquer? You get a deeply unstable balance. One where even internal security required violence. Spartans regularly declared ritual war on the Helots, just to remind them who was in charge. Secret police known as the Crypteia roamed the countryside, assassinating any Helot who looked too confident, too strong, or too proud. Even off the battlefield, Spartans remained soldiers. Always armed. Always watching. Because when everyone is trained to fight and no one is allowed to do anything else, the fight never ends. And here's where it gets strange. This single-minded focus didn't make Sparta rich. It didn't lead to art, innovation, or empire. In fact, Sparta eventually fell behind other Greek city-states in wealth and influence. Why? Because they didn't do anything. They didn't build temples. They didn't develop new ships or farming techniques. They didn't write symphonies or shape marble into gods. They trained. And they waited for the next war. And for a while, that was enough. Enough to dominate their region. Enough to terrify their neighbors. Enough to make their name echo through history. But it was also fragile. Because a warrior who only knows how to kill is lost when there's nothing left to fight. This is the tragic paradox of Sparta. They created the most disciplined warriors the world had ever seen, by stripping away every other aspect of life. And in doing so, they ensured that their warriors were great at dying well, but terrible at everything else. In most ancient Greek cities, identity was a mix of citizenship, family lineage, personal ambition, and community life. You could be a soldier and a poet, a thinker and a craftsman, a citizen and an individual. Not in Sparta. In Sparta, you were a function. And that function was war. Everything else, art, opinion, dreams, self-expression, was stripped away, not accidentally, but deliberately. Individualism wasn't just discouraged. It was treated like a disease. Something that could infect the phalanx, spread through the ranks, and fracture the discipline that made Sparta lethal. So they crushed it. From childhood, a Spartan was taught not to stand out. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't question authority. Don't excel for personal glory. Excel only as part of the unit. Even praise was collective. If a boy did well in training, the whole unit was credited. If he failed, the whole unit was punished. Because success didn't belong to the individual. It belonged to the system. And the system hated soloists. This might sound efficient, and it was. But it also created a population where personality became dangerous. Imagine living in a place where being too clever was suspicious. Where humor was viewed as weakness. Where creativity might be interpreted as rebellion. That was Sparta. Their architecture was simple. Their clothing was uniform. Their meals were shared and notoriously bland. Black broth, barley, whatever kept you moving. Nothing luxurious. Nothing expressive. Even music was militarized, chants and battle rhythms, not melodies for joy. It wasn't that Spartans couldn't be individuals. It's that they were trained out of it. Because in Sparta's eyes, the individual was a threat. A man who thought for himself might hesitate to die. A man with dreams might question his orders. And hesitation, in a battle line, meant death, not just for him, but for everyone beside him. So they built a culture where being invisible was a virtue. You didn't want to be the best. You wanted to be indistinguishable from the best. Same haircut. Same walk. Same scars. You existed to move in sync, not to shine. And those who did shine? They were dealt with. Sparta had no room for rebellious genius. No space for the eccentric inventor or the charismatic outlier. In Athens, a man like Socrates might be a philosopher. In Sparta, he'd be a problem. Even love was shaped by uniformity. Marriage wasn't about romantic connection. It was about strengthening the gene pool. Spartan weddings were rituals, brief, emotionless, and practical. Men didn't live with their wives until after age 30. The goal wasn't to build intimacy. It was to produce more warriors. And if a man showed too much affection, too much softness, he risked ridicule. Even within their own elite class, Spartans practiced self-erasure. They didn't inscribe their names on buildings. They didn't boast of their achievements. The only legacy that mattered was how well you followed orders, and how well you died. Because in Sparta, your worth wasn't determined by who you were. It was determined by how replaceable you had become. That's the irony at the heart of Spartan pride. They created the most legendary warriors in history, not by encouraging greatness, but by suppressing identity. They didn't want exceptional men. They wanted identical ones. And it worked. For a time. Sparta's unity made it invincible on the battlefield. Their warriors didn't break, because they had no self to protect. No ego. No ambitions beyond the phalanx. No reason to live other than to die the right way. But this same strength was also a weakness. Because when the wars slowed, when the population declined, when new ideas spread across Greece, Sparta had nothing to fall back on. No thinkers. No builders. No poets. Just silence. The machine they'd built, so precise, so disciplined, had no flexibility. It could fight. It could not adapt. And so, the society that erased individualism in the name of survival eventually faded, not in glorious combat, but in quiet irrelevance. Because the Spartans taught their citizens how to die with honor, but never how to live without war. What would it take to erase the most primal human instinct, the fear of death? If you ask Sparta, the answer was simple: start early. Strip the fear before it can even take root. And then replace it with something stronger: shame, duty, pride. That was the entire point of the Agoge, Sparta's infamous education system. It wasn't about making boys smart. It was about making them fearless. Or, to be more precise, making them fear the wrong things. Not death. But cowardice. Not pain. But weakness. Not dying in battle. But living in disgrace. From age 7, Spartan boys were ripped from their families and immersed in a world where death wasn't something to be avoided, it was something to train for. They weren't told death was tragic. They were told death was expected. Welcomed. They learned it through stories. Through ritual. Through daily hardship. But most importantly, they learned it by watching what Sparta valued. Only two kinds of people got headstones: warriors who died in battle, and mothers who died in childbirth. Everyone else was buried quietly, as if they hadn't done much of anything at all. That wasn't a minor detail, it was a curriculum. A quiet message screamed at every boy: die right, or be forgotten. So fear of death? It had no place. Not in the mess halls. Not in the training yards. Not in the songs sung before bed. Instead, they replaced it with mockery. Boys who flinched during drills were humiliated, laughed at, ostracized. Teachers encouraged bullying, not to be cruel, but to enforce collective toughness. Because in Sparta, you weren't allowed to fear anything except shame. And the punishments were never subtle. If a boy stole food and got caught, he was beaten, not for stealing, but for being caught. The real failure wasn't in breaking a rule, it was in failing to be better at surviving. The lesson? Outthink death. Outlast pain. Outgrow your instincts. The Spartans even had a word for those who broke under pressure: tremblers. A trembler wasn't just someone who ran from battle. It was anyone who let fear rule their body. Their punishment? Permanent social exile. Mocked. Avoided. Muted by the culture they'd failed to live up to. But here's the dark genius of it. Spartan education didn't just teach courage, it ritualized it. Every stage of a boy's training was a miniature death rehearsal. Sleep on a hard floor. Go hungry. Get beaten. Watch your friends suffer. Learn not to flinch. Learn not to cry. Learn to keep your breathing steady even when your mouth tastes blood. By the time a Spartan reached adulthood, his body knew pain intimately, but his mind had been taught to ignore it. To override it with something else. And that something else was glory. Glory wasn't a bonus in Spartan society. It was the only currency worth anything. A boy who died young in battle could achieve more honor than a man who lived to old age. Because glory in Sparta wasn't about accomplishment, it was about how well you disappeared. Not quietly, but correctly. That's why stories of the past mattered so much. Not because they were entertaining, but because they trained emotional response. Tales of men who held the line. Of soldiers who laughed as they died. Of boys who endured their beatings without making a sound. These weren't bedtime stories. They were operating manuals. Each one teaching, fear is a luxury you cannot afford. And they worked. Visitors from other Greek cities often noted how eerily calm Spartan soldiers were before battles. No pacing. No crying. Just sharpening weapons and eating quietly. Some were even rumored to comb their hair, ritually, before charging into death. Not out of vanity, but because order, ritual, and readiness were more powerful than dread. When you train death into the bones, dying becomes normal. Not easy. Not painless. Just expected. And that's what made the Spartan soldier so terrifying. He didn't want to die. He just didn't fear it. Because from the moment he could walk, he had been shown something worse than death. Disgrace. In most places, death marks the end. In Sparta, it was only the beginning, if you died the right way. Because to Spartans, dying in battle wasn't a tragedy. It was a triumph. A stamp of approval. The highest possible achievement. And if you managed it, you didn't just die, you rose. You became part of a mythic brotherhood. A name etched into memory. A story retold in whispers, in songs, in battle cries. Dying in battle meant eternal respect. That wasn't just romantic language. It was policy. Sparta had strict rules about who was remembered. Tombstones were rare. They didn't believe in cluttering the city with graves and monuments, unless you had earned it. And there were only two ways to do that: be a woman who died in childbirth, or a man who died in war. That was it. Not generals. Not philosophers. Not kings who lived to old age. Only those who gave their lives for Sparta. Because to the Spartan mind, dying in battle was the only proof that you had fulfilled your purpose. You had reached the finish line the way you were supposed to, with blood, loyalty, and no regrets. And for that, you were given something few Spartans ever received: individual recognition. Your name might be carved in stone. Your story might be told to the next generation. Your memory would be preserved, not just by your family, but by the state. That's how important battlefield death was. Other Greeks might raise statues of thinkers. Sparta raised stories of those who fell in formation. The funeral songs reflected this too. They didn't mourn. They celebrated. Warriors who died in battle were honored with chants, music, and public praise. Their families were elevated in status. Their mothers stood taller. Their brothers walked prouder. A good death wasn't just personal, it was political. It sent a message: the system works. The line holds. The blood was worth it. And everyone, from the lowest recruit to the highest commander, knew what was expected. When a Spartan warrior fell, he became part of the Spartan afterlife. Not one of ghosts or paradise, but one of legacy. You lived on in discipline. In ritual. In example. Children in the Agoge were taught your name. Your deeds. Your final words, if any were left. They didn't cry. They memorized. You became a lesson. There's even a recorded instance of a young Spartan boy saying he hoped to die soon, so he wouldn't have to live long enough to disgrace himself. That wasn't morbid. That was the training talking. The belief that a perfect death, frozen in time, was better than an imperfect life. That's how deeply the idea of eternal respect had taken root. Because Spartans didn't measure you by how long you lived. They measured you by how well you ended. The purest example of this? The tomb at Thermopylae. There's no long list of names. No massive sculpture. Just a short inscription carved in stone. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. It doesn't brag. It doesn't mourn. It simply states the truth. We followed the code. We stood our ground. We did our part. And in return, we are remembered. That's the deal every Spartan accepted. You give your body, your silence, your fear. And in exchange, you live forever, in the right way. So when a Spartan marched off to war, he didn't see a battlefield. He saw a final exam. The culmination of years of training. A one-shot chance to get it exactly right. And if he did, if he died where he was supposed to, how he was supposed to, with the shield still in hand, he didn't need a heaven. He had respect. And in Sparta, that was eternal. In most childhoods, violence is a warning sign. A red flag. Something adults try to correct. But in Sparta, violence wasn't a problem, it was a curriculum. A normal, daily part of life for boys. Not because they were out of control, but because the state needed them to be dangerous. And the only way to raise killers? Start young. Make violence a game. Then raise the stakes until it stops being one. Welcome to the Agoge, again, but this time, not just as boot camp. As a battleground. Boys as young as 7 were grouped into units and pushed to compete, physically, mentally, and socially. That competition often turned brutal. Wrestling, fighting, stealing, surviving hunger, all of it encouraged, even glorified. But the most disturbing part? The adults were watching. And grading. They didn't step in to stop the fights. They judged how well you endured them. How well you inflicted pain. How cleanly you broke another boy without losing control. It wasn't about chaos. It was about control through cruelty. Spartan boys weren't raised to be feral. They were raised to be disciplined predators. And nothing illustrated that more than the practice of ritualized violence. One of the most famous examples? The cheese altar. Yes, cheese. Here's how it worked. A pile of cheese would be placed on the altar of Artemis or Ther. Boys would be told to grab it. Simple, right? Except there were older boys waiting with whips. And they didn't just swing for show. They drew blood. The goal wasn't to win. The goal was to not retreat. Some boys walked away with scars that never faded. Others didn't walk away at all. And the crowd loved it. Parents, teachers, priests. It wasn't hidden, it was celebrated. Proof that pain built strength. That hesitation led to weakness. That a boy's body could be broken, but his courage couldn't. And if it could? Then Sparta didn't need him. The message was loud and clear. Your body is a tool. Your pain is practice. And your suffering is a gift, to the state, to the gods, and to your own transformation. There were no safe spaces. No breaks. No just boys being boys. Everything was calculated. Every bruise was a lesson. Every broken nose, a test. Every scar, a badge. Not in rebellion, but in obedience. Even friendships were shaped by this violence. Boys who trained together learned to hit each other and protect each other. One moment, you were grappling your closest ally into the dirt. The next, you were standing back to back in mock battle drills. It created a bond that was part trauma, part loyalty, and entirely useful for forming an unbreakable phalanx later on. Because if you could bleed together without resentment, you could die together without fear. This wasn't abuse. In Sparta, this was strategy. And it wasn't limited to formal drills. Fights broke out over stolen food, over insults, over challenges issued during public contests. But as long as it didn't disrupt the unit, or show cowardice, it was tolerated. Sometimes even encouraged. Because every fight was another chance to desensitize a boy to pain. To make him less human and more weapon. By the time a Spartan boy reached his teen years, he had likely endured dozens of beatings, participated in countless melees, and learned to inflict harm with eerie detachment. But what's more haunting? He'd learned to smile through it. To laugh at injury. To welcome the bruises. Because in his mind, They were proof he was getting closer to what Sparta wanted him to be. A ghost in the flesh. A body that didn't flinch. A soldier who didn't hesitate. So when you wonder how Spartan warriors could walk into certain death without blinking, remember this. They had already died a little in childhood. And they had learned, from age 7, that pain wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. If you walked past a group of Spartan boys training, you might mistake it for a riot. Dust clouds. Blooded lips. Bodies colliding with bone-breaking force. And yet, no one panicked. No one called for help. Because this wasn't chaos, it was curriculum. In Sparta, mock battles weren't just practice. They were preparation for real slaughter. And the violence wasn't watered down. It wasn't padded with helmets or rules or boundaries. These weren't sparring matches. They were simulations of war. Engineered to be just close enough to death to make the real thing feel familiar. The goal? Remove hesitation. Replace instinct with reflex. And turn boys into killers before they ever met an enemy. These mock battles weren't hidden or quiet. They were public. Entire crowds would gather to watch teenagers clash in full-contact melees. There were no age limits. No referees. No timeout if someone broke a nose or lost a tooth. Only one rule, fight like it's real. And it worked. Spartan boys who excelled in these contests earned respect. Those who faltered? Shame. Because it wasn't just about winning. It was about showing control. Could you stay calm while being hit? Could you follow commands while exhausted and bleeding? Could you take pain without freezing? Because if the answer was no, then how would you behave when the enemy was actually trying to kill you? These battles trained more than muscle. They trained mindset. And part of that training was unpredictability. You never knew when a mock ambush would come. You might be walking with your unit, and suddenly, another group would charge. The instructors would stand back and watch. No warnings. No instructions. Just reaction. It created a sense of permanent readiness, something deeply Spartan. A feeling that danger could come at any moment. So you learned to keep your shoulders relaxed, your eyes sharp, your shield close. Mock battles were also tactical exercises. Boys were taught how to move as a unit, how to form a phalanx, how to advance without breaking rank, how to rotate positions so no one burned out. But they were also taught to improvise. If a comrade fell, how do you close the gap? If you lose your weapon, what do you do? If your line is flanked, do you hold or fold? Every mock battle was a miniature war, and every miniature war was a test of who might be worthy to die in a real one. The stakes weren't life and death. But they felt like they were. And that feeling mattered. Because Spartans didn't want their warriors to be surprised by battle. They wanted battle to feel like home. Familiar. Almost comforting. A place where the rules were known, and the worst thing you could do wasn't lose, it was hesitate. That's why boys were often pushed to keep fighting even when injured. Blood on your face wasn't a reason to stop. It was a reason to push harder. Pain was not a warning sign. It was a signal, you're getting closer to what you're supposed to be. Some boys broke. Most didn't. Because by that point, they had learned it, the worst outcome wasn't a broken arm. It was showing fear in front of your brothers. Even watching these mock battles was part of the training. Younger boys would sit in rows, observing every move. Cheering for displays of toughness. Laughing at hesitation. And slowly, they'd learn what was expected. Not just strength. Composure. Not just survival. Submission to the state's vision of perfection. These weren't just playground fights. They were rituals. The slow, deliberate transformation of children into weapons. Into soldiers who didn't need to be told what to do. Who wouldn't ask questions when they were ordered to charge. Who wouldn't blink when told they wouldn't be coming back. So when you hear about Spartan bravery on the battlefield, how they never flinched, how they held the line even when outnumbered, it wasn't magic. It was muscle memory. They had already fought 1,000 times before they ever saw a real war. And most importantly, they had already learned the most Spartan lesson of all. Don't fear the fight. Fear failing to fight well. To understand the Spartan warrior, you can't just look at how he trained, you have to look at who trained him. Because in Sparta, boys weren't raised by parents after the age of 7. They were shaped by the state, and by older boys and men who had already survived the crucible of the Agoge. This system was called mentorship. But in practice, it was far more layered, intimate, and yes, controversial. At its core, Spartan mentorship was about creating bonds. Emotional. Physical. Sometimes even romantic or sexual. Because Sparta didn't believe the best warriors were trained with orders alone. They believed loyalty was strongest when it was personal. And that's where pederasty enters the conversation. In the ancient Greek world, relationships between older men and adolescent boys were not uncommon. In Athens, it was often intellectual, an older man teaching a younger one rhetoric, politics, philosophy. But in Sparta, the dynamic was different. It was less about debate and more about discipline. Spartan mentorship wasn't just companionship. It was grooming, in every sense of the word. A structured, socially accepted relationship where an older male, the inspirer, took on a younger boy, the beloved, as his protege. And often, this bond was reinforced with affection, touch, and, historically, sometimes sex. It's an uncomfortable truth. But it was built into the system. The idea was that emotional closeness would create fierce loyalty. That a boy would train harder, suffer more, fight braver, not just for Sparta, but for his mentor. And it worked. Boys in the Agoge who formed strong bonds with their mentors were often more disciplined, more obedient, and more fearless in mock battle. They wanted to impress. They wanted to be worthy. And they wanted, above all, not to disappoint the man who had molded them. But it wasn't all dark. Some mentorships were deeply respectful. Some were strictly platonic. Many Spartan historians, especially those writing from outside the culture, noted that physical affection was often discouraged from going too far. There were even laws against abuse. Sparta didn't encourage lust. It encouraged devotion. Because to them, this wasn't about love in the romantic sense. It was about shaping boys into men who felt owned, not by the mentor, but by the warrior ideal. Mentors acted as drill sergeants, older brothers, and sometimes surrogate fathers. They corrected posture, enforced silence, led training drills, taught boys how to take pain without flinching, how to fight in sync, how to die with their unit. They modeled what it meant to be a perfect Spartan. And if a boy faltered, his mentor bore some of the blame. The shame wasn't just individual. It was shared. That's why older Spartans didn't take mentorship lightly. It wasn't just prestige, it was responsibility. You were expected to take a younger boy and transform him into a warrior. To be strict. To be present. To be unrelenting. And in return, you got something powerful. You earned the boy's loyalty. His attention. His emotional investment. Which, on the battlefield, could be the difference between life and death. A boy wouldn't just fight beside you. He would die for you. That was the goal. And this didn't stop when the boy became a man. Many mentor-mentee relationships lasted into adulthood, evolving into lifelong alliances. These bonds shaped Spartan leadership, politics, and war strategy. Some modern minds want to interpret this through one lens. Was it abuse? Was it love? Was it manipulation? But in Sparta, it was something stranger. It was institutionalized intimacy, designed not for romance, not for philosophy, but for warfare. The most terrifying thing about the Spartan military wasn't its strength. It was its unity, its cohesion, its eerie calm under pressure. And much of that came from relationships forged not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet shadows of mentorship. These boys didn't just fight for Sparta. They fought for the man who had made them Spartan. And when death came, and it often did, they were ready. Not just because of training, but because someone had taught them how to die well. In most cultures, pain is something to avoid. Something to heal. Something to protect the next generation from. But not in Sparta. In Sparta, pain was heritage. Something sacred. Something earned, and then passed down, like a family crest etched in scars instead of stone. And to a Spartan, that was the true marker of manhood, not avoiding pain, but handing it off to someone younger. This wasn't accidental cruelty. It was deliberate legacy building. Older boys and young men who had survived the brutal Agoge were expected, required, to pass on what they had endured. Not by telling stories. By recreating it. Through drills, punishments, beatings, and discipline. What had been done to them, they now did to others. Not in vengeance. But in pride. Because in Sparta, surviving the pain wasn't just survival. It was qualification. If you had made it through the cold winters, the starvation, the bloody rituals, the mock battles, you had earned the right to teach. And that teaching almost always came with pain. It created a cycle, what we might call generational trauma, but what they called education. Every blow delivered was a reminder, I did this. And now, so will you. And it wasn't hidden. The state encouraged it. Supervised it. Praised it. A boy who didn't pass on what he had learned physically, through dominance and discipline, was seen as soft. A failure of mentorship. Someone who had survived the Agoge but hadn't internalized it. Because pain wasn't just something you got through. It was something you embraced. You were supposed to carry it in your bones, and then leave it in someone else's. This is how Sparta built its unshakable wall of warriors. Not just with training, but with tradition. Not just by toughening boys, but by teaching them that inflicting pain the right way was an act of love. Of loyalty. Of duty. This applied to physical suffering, yes, but also to emotional discipline. Mentors didn't just hit. They humiliated. If a boy cried, the older boys mocked him. If he broke formation, he was shamed. If he tried to stand out, he was isolated. And when he finally submitted, when he finally stopped trying to be anything other than what Sparta demanded, then he was considered ready. That breaking process, harsh as it was, became a point of pride. I survived it. I became what they couldn't kill. And now, I will make someone else become that too. And in this twisted pride was an eerie kind of love. Not soft. Not safe. But bonded. Because the boy being trained knew, this pain isn't random. It's tradition. It means I'm being accepted. I'm being shaped. I'm being trusted with the same brutality my mentor endured. And when it was his turn, he would pass it on too. Because nothing bonded Spartans more than shared suffering. Nothing said you belong like a bruise that someone older gave you, and someone younger would one day receive from you. Even the state reinforced this legacy. Older boys who passed on pain effectively, who hardened their mentees into tough, silent, obedient fighters, were praised. Elevated. Considered future leaders. They were proof that Sparta's brutal machine still worked. And when those boys finally fought side by side in real war, their bond was already sealed in blood. Because pain, when passed correctly, became something more powerful than fear. It became identity. And the mentor? The one who taught the boy how to hurt and how to hold the line? He became something even more sacred. He became the reason the next warrior didn't flinch. That's why Spartans weren't ashamed of the pain they caused. They were proud of it. Not because they were sadists. But because in their world, pain wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. A sign that the next generation would be just as unbreakable as the last. In most monarchies, kings rule from a throne. They wear jewels. Issue decrees. Stay behind the lines and survive for as long as possible. Because they are, after all, too important to die. Sparta didn't believe in that. In Sparta, a king didn't earn glory by staying alive. He earned it by dying correctly. Being royalty in Sparta didn't mean escaping the battlefield. It meant being the first on it. Because in the Spartan worldview, leadership wasn't about comfort or authority. It was about example. And there was no better example than a king who bled like everyone else. Sparta had a dual kingship system, 2 royal families, 2 kings reigning at the same time. One could stay home for religious and political duties. The other? He was expected to lead the army. In person. On the front line. That wasn't symbolic. That was protocol. A king who hesitated to fight would be disgraced. A king who returned from battle when others died? That could be even worse. He could be put on trial. Fined. Even exiled. Because in Sparta, nobility was not a shield. It was a target. Kings were supposed to be the first to charge, and the last to fall. Which brings us back to Leonidas, the king who chose death at Thermopylae not just because he had no other option, but because he understood the pressure. The expectation. He knew that returning home without his men would not be seen as survival. It would be seen as selfish. And for a Spartan king, selfishness was treason in royal robes. This wasn't a matter of honor in the abstract. It was written into the bones of the state. Kings took oaths to defend Sparta with their lives. Not their strategies. Not their speeches. Their bodies. And if they failed, they were judged more harshly than anyone else. Because if the king was weak, what hope did the people have? That pressure wasn't just ceremonial. It was constant. From the moment a royal heir was born, he was watched. Not to see how well he spoke or dressed, but how well he endured. Was he tough? Silent under pain? Brave under threat? Could he fight like the lowest-born Spartan warrior? Because if he couldn't, he was unfit to rule. There are stories of Spartan kings fighting in the line beside their men, not behind them. No special armor. No private guard. Just a shield, a spear, and the knowledge that every pair of eyes was watching. The men needed to see their king sweat, bleed, fall, and rise again. Why? Because that made them less afraid. A king who died with his troops became more than a monarch, he became a myth. And myths don't die. They're retold. And in a society like Sparta, where dying well was the ultimate act, kings weren't expected to live long reigns. They were expected to end them in a final act of defiance. A death that could be sung. A legacy that would shape the next generation of warriors, who'd hear the story and say, "That's how you die for Sparta." But not all kings lived up to it. When they didn't, the backlash was immediate and brutal. One Spartan king, Demaratus, fled to Persia after being accused of cowardice. His name was scrubbed from pride, remembered only as a shadow of what not to be. A reminder that royalty alone didn't grant honor. Only sacrifice did. That's what made Spartan royalty so unique. You weren't born into glory. You died into it. Which meant that from the day a young prince could lift a shield, the clock was ticking, not on how long he'd live, but on how well he would end. Because in Sparta, a crown was not a privilege. It was a deadline. Leonidas didn't die because he lost. He died because he chose to win, on Sparta's terms. And in Sparta, that meant dying gloriously. There's a difference between being killed and choosing to die well. Leonidas understood that distinction better than anyone. He knew that a Spartan king's greatest power wasn't his authority, it was the example he left behind. And that example had to be perfect. Unflinching. Mythic. So when he led the 300 Spartans to Thermopylae, he wasn't being reckless. He wasn't delusional. He was following a cultural script written long before he ever sat on the throne. The Persian army, by every account, was enormous, hundreds of thousands strong. Sparta sent just a few hundred. And Leonidas? He didn't bring his youngest or his flashiest warriors. He brought men who had already fathered sons. Warriors who had completed the most sacred Spartan duty, reproducing future soldiers. That choice wasn't random. It was surgical. Leonidas knew they weren't coming back. And he wanted to make sure their deaths would be remembered, not just as a tragedy, but as a lesson. Every move he made at Thermopylae had dual meaning. Tactical and symbolic. His stand in the narrow pass wasn't just about terrain, it was about making a point. That Sparta didn't fear impossible odds. That a true Spartan, not just a soldier, but a king, could face death with discipline and calm. Even when the Persians offered surrender, Leonidas responded in true Spartan fashion, "Come and take them." No negotiation. No plea. Just defiance. He wasn't posturing. He was performing. Because that one-liner wasn't for Xerxes, it was for the boys back in Sparta. For the mothers who'd buried sons. For the next king, who'd need a model of how to die well. Leonidas wasn't just leading. He was demonstrating. And that demonstration would become the foundation of Spartan national identity. Because after Thermopylae, Sparta didn't collapse. It rallied. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 warriors didn't weaken the Spartan myth, it cemented it. Every death there became fuel. Every corpse, a building block of the legacy. But let's be clear, Leonidas didn't want martyrdom. He wanted precision. A death that wasn't desperate or chaotic. A death that reinforced the idea that Sparta always holds the line, even when the line is doomed. And that's exactly what happened. When the final blow came, Leonidas fell where he stood. Surrounded. Unmoving. Still in formation. And Sparta took note. He was given posthumous honors. Songs. Statues. A tomb at Thermopylae bearing a humble, haunting inscription, not naming him, but celebrating the obedience of those who died by his side. Because that was the real glory. Not that he was king. But that he died like a Spartan. And in doing so, Leonidas did something most leaders can't. He became eternal. His death became the answer to every question a Spartan boy might ask. What does loyalty look like? What does courage sound like? How should a leader fall? Like Leonidas. He gave Spartans a blueprint for the perfect ending. One that didn't rely on victory. One that didn't depend on numbers, weapons, or strategy. Just discipline. Faith in the code. And a willingness to stand where others would run. That's why his name still echoes, not because he was extraordinary, but because he fulfilled the ideal completely. And when a society builds itself on a myth like that, it doesn't fade quickly. Even after Sparta's military power waned, even after its political influence shrank, the memory of Leonidas remained. Because a king who dies gloriously becomes more than a man. He becomes a standard. And in Sparta, that was the only kind of royalty that mattered. We love Spartans. Or at least, we think we do. Modern pop culture has turned them into symbols of badassry. Muscles. Grit. Heroic last stands. We wear their quotes on gym shirts. We make movies where they yell into the face of death and look good doing it. But here's the thing. We've completely misunderstood what made Spartans brave. Because Spartan bravery wasn't swagger. It wasn't chest-thumping or glory hunting. It wasn't about looking fearless. It was about being obedient. Real Spartan bravery wasn't about attitude. It was about discipline. The kind so deep, so absolute, that it overrode survival instinct. Modern audiences see Leonidas and think, wow, what courage. But Spartans didn't call it courage. They called it duty. And there's a difference. We imagine Spartan warriors as rebels. Free thinkers. Men who defied the odds and carved their own fate. In reality, they were trained, shaped, and commanded from birth. They didn't act alone. They couldn't. Individual action was discouraged. The bravest thing a Spartan could do wasn't to lead the charge. It was to stay in line. To not flinch. To do exactly what was expected, even when it meant death. Especially when it meant death. And here's where we get it wrong. We think they embraced battle because they loved it. They didn't. They embraced battle because they were told to. Because their entire world, their family, their religion, their laws, had taught them that there was no greater good than dying the right way. So it wasn't bravery the way we define it today. It was more like ritual submission. That doesn't make it less impressive. In fact, it might make it more terrifying. Because a Spartan didn't need to be brave in the moment. He had already rehearsed his death 100 times in childhood. Through drills. Through scars. Through stories sung in the mess halls. By the time he stood on the battlefield, fear had nowhere left to live inside him. But when we tell their stories today, we edit that out. We highlight the abs and the battle cries. We forget the years of starvation, the institutional violence, the constant surveillance, the erasure of identity. We forget that their bravery was born from a system that broke them before it built them. We imagine that we could be like them, if we just worked out harder. But Spartan bravery didn't come from strength. It came from submission to something bigger than the self. And that's what makes it so hard for modern people to truly understand. Because we live in a world that celebrates individuality, self-expression, personal dreams, choice. Sparta crushed all of that. It didn't ask boys to be brave. It didn't inspire them to be fearless. It forced them. So when we quote Leonidas or wear a Spartan helmet on our t-shirt, we're usually channeling an idea of rebellion. But Leonidas wasn't rebelling. He was complying. And here's the kicker, that doesn't make him weak. It makes him more dangerous. Because a man who submits completely to an ideal will go farther than one who fights for pride. He won't just die for his brothers. He'll do it without flinching. Without speech. Without expectation. Because in Sparta, the bravest man wasn't the loudest. He was the one who stayed quiet. Who stood where he was told. Who died where he was placed. And who never once thought, what if I ran? That's not movie bravery. That's something else. Something colder. Sharper. And maybe even more impressive. So why does the Spartan legacy still linger? Why do we keep circling back to it, obsessing over warriors who lived over 2,000 years ago? Why do their stories echo through film, literature, even the way we market fitness and masculinity? Because deep down, we're not just fascinated by their strength. We're haunted by what it took to create it. Spartans weren't born fearless. They were stripped of fear. They weren't born loyal. They were conditioned to obey. They weren't born united. They were taught to sacrifice selfhood for survival. And that's what sticks with us. Because in a world where we're encouraged to be individuals, to express, to feel, to break down and rebuild, Sparta is a ghost of the opposite path. A society that didn't just reject emotion and softness, but surgically removed it. Deliberately. Proudly. They made warriors who would never hesitate. But they also made people who could never truly be free. That paradox is what makes them so haunting. We admire their discipline, their courage, their sacrifice. But then we look closer, and we realize, those weren't traits. They were requirements. The Spartan system didn't inspire greatness. It manufactured it. And once you see that, the cost becomes clear. To raise one perfect warrior, you had to crush 100 children. To create one Leonidas, you had to build a city that normalized pain, silenced dissent, and rewarded death more than life. And they did it well. Too well. So well that thousands of years later, we're still trying to figure out whether to envy them, or feel sorry for them. Because what do you call a culture where living is just a waiting room for dying the right way? What do you call a people who believe that the best thing a man could do was disappear with dignity? That's the echo that never fades. It follows us in gym slogans that say no pain, no gain. In movies where the hero is silent, scarred, and stoic. In the way we romanticize sacrifice, without always asking what it's for. And maybe that's the most Spartan thing of all. Dying in battle without questioning the battle. To this day, we carry pieces of that mindset. We respect the disciplined, the quiet, the strong. We're suspicious of emotion, indulgence, vulnerability. Sparta would be proud of that. But Sparta is also gone. And maybe that's the final warning. Because a society that teaches its people to embrace death will, eventually, run out of people. The same code that made Sparta strong, also made it unsustainable. They didn't innovate. They didn't adapt. They just trained and fought until there was no one left to carry the shield. And yet, their image endures. Not because we want to be them, but because we wonder what would become if we were. What if we feared shame more than death? What if we valued obedience over identity? What if we believed that the best life was one that ended early, but honorably? That's what makes the Spartan legacy so haunting. It isn't just about what they did. It's about what they gave up, willingly, to do it. And whether or not we could ever make that same choice. Spartan warriors didn't fight for glory. They fought because they were built to. Trained not to survive, but to stand, bleed, and fall without complaint. Their strength came at the cost of softness, selfhood, and everything we consider human. And maybe that's why their story lingers, not because we want to be them, but because we wonder what would become if we tried. In a world obsessed with survival, Sparta reminds us that sometimes, the most terrifying warriors are the ones who never plan to come home.